Okay, well, good evening to those of you in the room and to those of you who are joining us online, and welcome to the annual Ian and Mildred Karten Memorial Lecture. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Neil Gregor, and I'm the current director of the Parkes Institute. And it's a very great privilege to chair an event which honours the immense contribution that Ian and Mildred Karten made to the Parkes Institute, both over the course of their own lives and latterly via the Ian Karten Charitable Trust since their passing. Ian Karten, for those of you who don't know, was a young refugee who came to the UK in the late 1930s on a scholarship which enabled him to study at the University of London. And it was an early encounter with the Reverend James Parkes, after whom our institute is named, at the home of Parkes, which brought him into contact with Parkes's work on behalf of refugees, and which then marked the start of a very long association between Karten and what was to become the Parkes Institute. Ian eventually became a successful engineer, and also a generous philanthropist. And much of the work that the Parkes Institute has been able to do over the last 20 to 30 years has rested on the generosity of Ian and Mildred, and latterly on the generosity of the trust that bears their name. So we are delighted this year, and of course every year, to mark that generosity and that commitment by holding this lecture. More than that, of course, and the generosity of the Kartens notwithstanding, it's the experiences of people like Ian Karten as a young refugee coming to this country, which gives the Parkes Institute so much of its meaning and purpose. This year, I'm very grateful to welcome Dr. Yannick Greta, who gives tonight's lecture. Yannick joined the University of Southampton and the Parkes Institute at the start of this academic year, but he's a long-established specialist both in Polish studies and in Holocaust studies. He's the author of a number of significant articles on Polish memory culture, as well as a fascinating study of Holocaust exhibitions in contemporary Poland. So I'm delighted to welcome him here to give this lecture tonight, and in a broader sense, of course, to welcome him to the university and to the institute. He's currently working on a book on memories of the Holocaust in Poland in the slightly earlier period than his first book, and I think he'll be drawing on both past and current work to offer his lecture on the question of whether Poles have forgotten the Holocaust, remembering the genocide of the Jews in socialist and post-socialist Poland. So, Yannick, over to you.
Thank you very much for welcoming me, and thank you very much for this kind welcome. Shall we?
Yeah, I'm just going to turn this off on the screen for you.
Okay, perfect. Please bear with while we set everything up.
It's touchscreen, isn't it? You touch it. We've just realised the screen is also touchscreen.
2 years of working from home on Zoom, and we still can't cope. But here we are. Thank you very much. Thank you, Neil, for the invitation and for this kind of introduction. And thank you all for coming today. When we were organizing this lecture and we put the title up, Have Poles Forgotten the Holocaust? Colleagues from security contacted us asking if we need additional security presence at this event because of the controversy related. I hope none of you will accost me and attack me after the lecture, but luckily we haven't revealed the whole title to the colleagues from security, because actually what I really want the title to be is Have Poles Forgotten the Holocaust, and does it even matter? Which would be probably even more controversial. And the reason I want to start with this controversy is not only because I want to advertise research on Poland, and I know that Poland maybe is not the most mainstream of all topics, but because I think genuinely this is an important question. Does it even matter if we remember the Holocaust in our communities? This question is asking multiple different communities across the globe in which Holocaust is remembered, in this country notwithstanding. And I think it does matter. And I think the answers to that question ultimately differ depending on where we are geographically. In case of Poland, the reason why Poles should or do remember the Holocaust is at least twofold. On the one hand, obviously, Holocaust took place in Poland. More importantly, quite a number of Poles were somehow involved in those events, co-participated, were the onlookers, the witnesses, but also killers. And so it definitely makes sense for Poles to remember, try to grapple with that knowledge somehow. But probably on a bigger scale, and something that is definitely more visible currently in how Holocaust is remembered, is that it also is important for us to use collective memory to define who we are. So as collectivities, as groups, as nations, we remember fragments from our past. And so if you remember the Holocaust, we naturally include the people who suffer in it in our group. One of my colleagues working on those similar topics, she's a sociologist, she works on contemporary Poland, calls this interest, she calls it resurrection of the Jew, the interest in Jewish topics, the interest in the Holocaust, which is quite visible these days in Poland. She says that resurrection of the Jew serves to soften, stretch, and reshape the symbolic boundaries of Polishness. And I follow her in many ways in this. For me, remembering the Holocaust and answer the question, does it really matter, lies, in case of Poland, largely in this. Remembering the Holocaust matters because if we remember Jewish suffering, if we say that there were Jewish Poles who suffered, we include them in the community of Poles. And so therefore we include people who are not ethnically Polish in communities of Poles today. This is quite a big problem for a country that is these days predominantly monoethnic, often monoreligious, often seen as monoreligious. And so that kind of question, does it matter? Yes, it matters. In Poland, it matters a lot because some Poles were involved and because today Poland tries to see itself as a monoethnic country and struggles with minorities. And so imagining minorities as part of history matters. But now to the first part of my question, have Poles forgotten the Holocaust? Even that short quote can suggest that yes, maybe they have. Dłużycki here works on the assumption largely that the interest in the Holocaust, the interest in the Jewish past more broadly, is something relatively new. She talks about the resurrection of the Jew, right? So she talks about how this interest boomed, emerged only recently. While she in her own research touches on like late 80s sometimes, in principle, the assumption of a lot of scholars is that actually there is almost nothing happening when it comes to Holocaust memory, memory of the Jewish past before the Holocaust in the communist Poland, and it is rather only after 89 that things change. I will contest that assumption today. One of the things that I want to do in the lecture today is to show you that actually this is not entirely the case. But before I start contesting this assumption, I want to show you why we think so, or why there is actually a reason to question whether Holocaust was remembered, or maybe rather question how Holocaust was remembered in the first decades after the Second World War under the communist authoritarian regime. One of the first monuments to the Holocaust is actually this one, the monument to the Ghetto Heroes, which is in Warsaw. Actually, there were two erected. First one, even after the war instantly, and then it was replaced with this one in 1948. So very, very early on, just a couple of years after the war ends, a monument commemorating Holocaust, and especially the Ghetto uprising, the uprising in Ghetto in Warsaw, is erected. But this often is seen as one of the very few examples of Holocaust memory in Poland. And actually, what a lot of scholars writing about this monument highlight is the fact that soon afterwards, from around 49, it is impossible to actually meaningfully talk about the Holocaust. This is a very interesting monument. It's, as you can see, it's a pretty big construction, unmistakably Jewish. If you look at this, you see that this is definitely commemorating Jewish fight and suffering. You see the menorahs on both sides of the monument. The monument itself has those two set of sculptures, one from the front side, one from the back side. On the one side of the monument, what we see is a group of fighters in the ghetto. On the other side, what we see is a group of people being led to their death. And amongst them, as you can actually see on the screen here, there is a child and a woman. And these are quite important symbols for us as well, because as I will tell you later today, in some cases, the socialist authorities aimed to remove children from memorials. For example, in Birkenau, in Auschwitz, because if there are no children, only adults, we can pretend that this is a memorial to political prisoners, to communist fighters, but obviously we cannot say that children were political prisoners. So this monument is actually very obviously commemorating the Holocaust, the name, the design, what's depicted, how it's depicted. But at the same time, soon afterwards, there will be no possibility to erect this monument. From 1949 onwards, the communist authorities dominate Polish cultural life to the extent in which they can really veto such investments. So the story goes. As the example of this, actually the broader neighborhood of Muranów, when this monument is erected, is often given. The first design for Muranów was supposed to highlight the fact that Muranów is a neighborhood built on a former ghetto. Almost every building somehow marked the memory of the ghetto. There were designs going as far as using the old bricks, the color of the buildings, the design of the buildings was all somehow supposed to mark the Jewishness of the site and the suffering on that site. But the actual buildings that were built are nondescript, white, boring buildings that do not anyhow remember the Holocaust. And this is one of the kind of big standard stories very often given in this narrative of Poles forgetting the Holocaust. In 1948, it is still possible to erect the monument, but soon afterwards, Holocaust will be forgotten. As an example here, and this is an example which is absolutely accurate, and I will not defend or contest this example, we often give the examples of a lot of the monuments from death camps. This one is Chełmno, Krumlov, one of the smallest death camps that was created on Polish soil. And this monument is quite striking, quite powerful. However, it is often compared, the design of it, to a sacrificial table. And you can probably see that in the design. But the idea of a sacrificial table is quite problematic when we think about the Holocaust, because sacrifice suggests willingness, choice, and a cause. And we can't potentially say that people dying in death camps, the Jews dying in concentration camp, done that because they laid their life of an altar of a cause. They were dragged there against their will. So that's the design of the monument itself doesn't necessarily speak about the Holocaust as an event. But this is even more visible if we actually read the inscription on the side of the monument. And this is the inscription. We were taken from an old man to a baby between the towns of Koła and Dąbie. We were taken to the forest and then we were gassed, shot and burned. So we ask our future brothers to punish our murderers. We once again ask the witnesses of our oppression who live in this area to spread the word about the murder around the world. There's one more missing from this text. The original text had the word Jews in it. It is actually taken from a small note left in the camp by members of the Sonderkommando operating in the camp. So by the prisoners, by the Jewish prisoners who were forced to help Nazis operate the camp. They left the note behind them. It was hidden in the camp. It was eventually recovered. And most of the text that was left behind is on the memorial, except for the one word, Jews. And that is removed. Most of the other camp memorials are like that. In Treblinka, you can just about glean from the design of the memorial that maybe there is something about Jewish suffering, about the Holocaust in there. But in Bełżec, in Sobibór, and obviously in Birkenau, in the memorial from the 60s, all the markers of Jewishness are carefully removed to the point in which, as I mentioned, in Auschwitz, actually, apparently just a couple of days before the unveiling of the monument, the figure of a child was removed, the symbolic figure of a child was removed from the monument, specifically because the authorities, the communist authorities, could not claim that children are political prisoners. The child suggests obviously suffering for different causes. Here a reference to children is retained, but the word Jews is removed. And so indeed it seems that some effort was taken to either not remember the Holocaust or rather remember specific aspects of it. Polish help is very often mentioned in a lot of the commemorations in the communist era, in the socialist era. If the Holocaust is commemorated, and I will talk later about, for example, the Ghetto Uprising annual commemorations, in the communist era, those were commemorations of Polish helpers. This is a topic that can be mentioned. Jewish suffering, not very interesting. Polish help, absolutely yes. In many ways, those efforts at forgetting, recasting the memory of the Holocaust as the kind of memory of Christian helpers culminated in 1968. I'm deviating from the topic a little bit here. This is the train station called Warszawa Gdańska, from which the remainder of the Polish Jews still living in the country in the 60s were expelled from. This is the station for which they traveled. In the mid-60s, in the late 60s, 67, 68, Polish communist authorities organized this, what they refer to as anti-Zionist, code name for an anti-Semitic campaign, during which remainder of the Polish Jews who still lived in the country were expelled. And I'm bringing this to your attention not only because I want to highlight the anti-Semitism persisting in the country at this stage, but rather because actually the campaign itself, the anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, as they refer to it, campaign starts with memory of the Holocaust. One of the first salvos in this campaign in 67 was the so-called case of the encyclopedia authors. Throughout the 60s, one of the big Polish publishing houses is publishing the Great Encyclopedia of Poland. And in 67, they released a volume which has an article about concentration camps. The article actually stated that there were two types of camps, concentration camps and death camps, and that the death camps were predominantly for Polish Jews, for Jews in general, and that vast majority of the victims in those death camps were Jews. The authors were accused of anti-Polish bias, of hatred towards Poles. They didn't understand Poland or Polishness, and that kind of language was employed to attack them. They were summarily fired. Around 20 people were fired from the publishing house. Most of them were forced to leave the country. And so in many ways, this campaign, and especially this Holocaust Center episode, confirms the importance of Holocaust memory. At the very beginning of my lecture, I mentioned Zubrzycki and her research, and she says that Holocaust, that the figure of the Jew can be used to stretch or harden the borders of Polishness. And I guess 68 is a very good example of this happening. 68 is the moment when authorities use multiple anti-Semitic cliches, but also falsify Holocaust memory, specifically with the intention of hardening the boundaries of Polishness, equating Polishness with ethnic Polishness. And this is what we kind of see happening. This is one of the kind of moments which attests to us about the importance of Holocaust memory again. Quite interestingly, the idea of expelling the remainder of the Jews from Poland in many ways backfired on the communist authorities, because the Jews who still lived in the 60s in Poland had relatively small profile. They were there, they were doing quite interesting things with memory. I'm going to talk about it in a second, but they were largely invisible. And it is only the anti-Semitic campaign on 67, 68 that reminds Polish intelligentsia that Poland used to be a multi-ethnic country, that there used to be Jewish Poles living in this country, living amongst us. And so it is actually from 68 onwards in 70s that we see Polish intelligentsia recovering the memory of Poland, of the Polish Jewish life, recovering the information of the Holocaust. There are projects about photographing, for example, the remaining Jewish cemeteries, which at this stage are quite dilapidated, quite beautiful, but quite dilapidated. And there is some work done on recovering the information about the Holocaust as well. All that work happens in the, for example, so-called clubs of Catholic intelligentsia, small groups, but quite influential in many ways. And it culminates in this article. This is an article from 1987, written by a literary critic from Yale University, Jan Błoński, who in the article analyzes a poem by Czesław Miłosz. Czesław Miłosz, the Nobel Prize winning poet, who at this stage obviously lives already in States. In one of his poems talks about the Ghetto Uprising and specifically focuses on the Polish inaction during the uprising. Błoński, in this article published in Tygodnik Powszechny, Catholic Weekly, very influential at this stage, but still of relatively low circulation, Błoński reminds his readers that actually majority of the Poles were not the helpers as we would like to see. Majority of the Poles were rather onlookers, passive people who did not extend help. And actually Błoński's stance here is that as a Catholic, he thinks this is a sin of not doing enough, and Poles are guilty of that. This causes quite a big shock. Poles thus far were quite accustomed to not thinking about the Holocaust at all, or if they were thinking about the Holocaust, it was about the Polish help. And suddenly, after kind of a decade of small-scale, low-level works of intellectuals, Błoński comes forward, says, no, we are not the nation of helpers. We are the nation of people who did not do enough for our brothers. That's the kind of language he uses. And this is obviously published, like I said, in a Catholic Weekly, and he uses this kind of Catholic language of guilt and sin. And so this is the kind of standard story that is quite often told about Polish memory of the Holocaust in the communist period. Holocaust is mostly forgotten, maybe some Polish help is remembered. The camps serve to commemorate something, but it is unclear of what. Maybe the suffering of the Polish political prisoners, maybe of the communist fighters against imperialism, certainly not Jewish suffering. And then if something about the memory of the Holocaust is done in communist Poland, it is done by people like that, Catholic intellectuals, professors of universities, who occasionally write articles here and there, who organize projects about photographing Jewish cemeteries. And I want to change that picture a little bit. It is mostly accurate in that the camps didn't mark Jewish suffering, that Błoński wrote this article and it was quite a controversial, important piece. But this is not the whole story. Information about the Holocaust, different types, were passed from generation to generation. And Holocaust was remembered and commemorated quite extensively, actually. On this slide, you can actually see a series of photographs and a map which should be much more robust than it is right now. Please don't tell my funders that this still looks that way. It should be more, there should be more on this map. But even that short map that I'm building, working on, shows you the scale of Holocaust memory in one of the regions in Poland. On this slide, you can see 3 different monuments representing 3 different waves of commemoration, organized predominantly by Jewish Poles, either people who still resided in Poland before '68, or on the last one, people who came back from abroad to fund memorials in their hometowns. The first wave of commemoration, 40s after the war, people who are coming back from the USSR, from the forests, from DP camps. They are trying to rebuild their lives. They are marking the suffering of members of their communities. There's quite a lot of those memorials, almost no systematic research about those. I'm slowly trying to piece together that story. This is predominantly the survivors marking the spaces of suffering that they remembered from just a couple of years ago. That wave slowly winds down in the later 40s. Middle photograph, mid-60s. There is in mid-60s quite a lot of commemorative efforts. All the memorials in death camps, I have mentioned those to you. The big ones sponsored by the government, really big in size. They mark the most important, most well-known sites like the death camps. But the Polish Jews who still live in the country, at the same time, using the same governmental funds, actually erect dozens of memorials marking not the death camps, but the spaces of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, towns and villages, forest clearings and ditches by the roads, where vast majority of the Jewish Poles are actually killed. A lot of Jewish Poles will die in the camps, but a lot of them die around the areas where they lived, in the villages, in the towns. And so the Jewish Poles in the 60s actually systematically mark those spaces. In this middle section of the slide, you can see the map. I'm trying to map the memorials from eastern Poland, and there is quite a lot of those, as you can see. And you can actually see one of the memorials here from the town called Słomniki. This memorial is quite interesting because, like all the memorials from all 3 waves, it very openly talks about the Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. It doesn't use the word Holocaust. This word is not in use just yet at this stage, but it talks about Żydzi, the Jews. Żydzi is the Polish word for the Jews. It is written in two languages. This one is in Polish and in Hebrew. Sometimes it's Polish and Yiddish, most likely Polish and Yiddish. On all the monuments from that period erected by the Jewish Poles, there are symbols like a Star of David. So symbols that cannot be associated or mistaken for something that is not Jewish. The language itself, obviously the font itself speaks to the Jewishness of the place. The descriptions on those monuments are very often quite detailed. They very often inform the passersby that in 1942, in the summer of 1942, the Jews, the Żydzi from the local town were gathered here by the Nazi thugs or whatever else, the Hitlerites, and were murdered here in this space. And so the Holocaust memory actually is perpetuated in those monuments erected by the survivors. After 1968, there are almost no survivors left in Poland. There is still a couple of thousand people, but these are mostly elderly. They are impoverished. The organizations that still live are not in position to organize any more commemorations, it seems. But in the 80s, later 80s, when there is a little bit of this kind of late socialist liberalization happening, some of the survivors can fund projects like this one at the very end. This is a project commemorating the suffering of the Muława Jews, erected by the survivors. And actually, the gentleman on the left is the person who erected that, who flew back to see the unveiling of the memorial. And again, this is not systematic research. I'm trying to look for evidences of those commemorative campaigns as well. But it seems that there were quite a lot of memorials erected in the 80s as well, in the spaces which didn't get their memorials, the recognition in 40s or in 60s. And so while the most important mainstream government-sponsored memory, the most visible memory, is that of somebody suffering, but not very clearly said who's suffering. These are memorials in the camps. At the same time, a lot of the other spaces of Jewish suffering are actually marked by memorials that are very, very obviously Jewish. And so we cannot actually say that Holocaust wasn't remembered. These are small-scale memorials, often out of the beaten track, often on sides of the roads, in forest clearings. And so sometimes maybe they are slightly invisible, but they are there. And they actually perform, it seems, quite important work for the communities. And I can risk saying that because in my current research, I'm also looking at documents like this one. This is a report written by Polish scouts in 1965. I'm just going to hope that it's fine. Wow. Like I said, this is a report written by Polish scouts in 1965. In 1965, Polish scouts were sent to learn from the Book of the Land. That was the campaign that was organized for them. The idea is that they're supposed to walk around the schools, interviewing elderly people who remember the war, and they are supposed to learn by the glorious fight of the Poles against the evil Germans. That is the setup. And actually, as I am finding out, they did learn about that. They also learned about plenty of Polish suffering. And interestingly, they learned quite a lot about Jewish suffering. This report is one of those that actually where the scouts didn't find any information about Polish fighters or even about Polish martyrs. Rather, they only learned about the plight of the Brzozów Jews. Brzozów is a small town in southern Poland, and quite a lot of those stories that I'm finding right now are about places like that. Small towns, villages, maybe shtetls, where there was quite a lot of Jewish people who were then murdered by the Nazis. And suddenly, when the scouts come and visit and ask around what happened here during the war, the only story they hear, all the Jewish members of Brzozów, Jewish citizens of Brzozów were killed. There is a memorial in Brzozów. It's actually depicted on this small map here, as you can see in the corner. Interestingly, the Jewish memorial, which actually has a Star of David on it, here in this rendering has a cross. The Polish scouts weren't very knowledgeable and maybe didn't fully distinguish that the Jewish people and cross, that's not the same religion. But nevertheless, what they have done is that they interviewed local witnesses, and the witnesses talked a lot and in a very gruesome detail about what happened. A lot of the descriptions I'm looking at now really in minor details explain what happened, how the Nazis arrived, how they selected the Jews, how they gathered them in school grounds or in a square, and how smaller groups were moved to a local forest, how the killings were organized, who dug the graves, how the bodies were piled up, including, and this is quite a gruesome detail, that some people weren't killed in the first place, but were put alive in the graves and only suffocated later. All that is there, all that suffering is described in a very, very minor detail. And those stories are passed quite freely. From the documents I'm seeing now, it seems that there are three main motivations to me to pass the stories. Very often there is a Jewish monument. The Jewish survivors have already marked that space. And so when the scouts arrive in the village or in the town, the citizens, the witnesses will actually say, yes, we have this monument because this is what happened. And this is the story that is passed from generation to generation. Equally, the Polish help is remembered. Quite often we hear about a Polish family that was killed because they helped a Jewish family. Interestingly, in most cases I have found thus far, the Polish family is named, the Jewish family is never named. Nevertheless, the information that some Jews were trying to survive, maybe didn't manage to survive, that is often given. And equally, there's the third category where there doesn't seem to be any obvious trigger for the memories. There is no monument, there is no ethnic Polish connection, but nevertheless, the witnesses speak, and in the detail, like I said. I think, this is a little bit of a speculation, I think this is genuinely the trauma of the witnesses coming forward. The people who witnessed maybe somehow participated, maybe moved into Jewish houses, maybe helped round up the Jewish citizens of their towns, remember, and after 20 years have a need to share that story and the stories they share. I haven't quantified that yet. The scouts went systematically through the whole of the country. There is 20,000 reports like this one. 1 million of scouts went out listening to the stories. I haven't quantified that, so I can't tell you how extensively stories about the Holocaust were shared. But from the region I'm looking right now, almost in every county, at least 20-50 scouts heard something about the Holocaust. So there is quite a big scale of that. This is not unknown. The Holocaust is not unknown. The information about the Holocaust are passed on a local level about the local events from generation to generations in the 60s. So we cannot really genuinely say that Holocaust is actually completely forgotten in Poland. There is quite a lot of that memory that is there. And so the question stands, is the fall of the communism, for the socialism, important for that story of remembering the Holocaust? Why are so many people almost fixating on it and put the 89, this end of communism in Poland, as the very big important border? Partially because many things do change, socially, economically, politically. And so there is this perception that if so many things change in the realm of politics, a lot of other things changed as well. But partially because genuinely there were changes. For example, in Birkenau, in Auschwitz, the monument stays the same. So at the back, you can see the sculpture from the 60s that is still there, and this was unaltered. What is being changed are the plaques in front of the monument. The plaques, if I remember correctly, from the top of my head, 27 languages. Thus far, before 89, we're talking about the 4 million dead. And those 4 million were poorly defined, but essentially were political prisoners and communist fighters against imperialism. Broadly, in the museum in Auschwitz, the information about Jewish suffering is there. Very often in alphabetical lists of listing all the nationalities suffering more broadly in Auschwitz without any numbers, so we don't know how many from which category died. But there will be an alphabetical list, and the Jews will be under Żydzi, or puzzlingly, under I, Israelis, which really doesn't make sense at that stage. So the information is somewhere there. It's just not foregrounded in the way that it should be. The camp is presented as a space of suffering for multiple people from multiple nationalities, mostly because of the political leanings. The fact that this is also a space for where the genocide takes place, that is obscured. And that changes in the 90s. Already in 91, new plaques with the number of 1 million dead, just above 1 million, are there. And the fact that Birkenau is predominantly a space of extermination, systematic extermination of Jewish people for who they are, not what they do, that is already there. So some of the big changes are certainly there. Equally, the things that were happening already before are reshaped. So, for example, the anniversary of the ghetto uprising is marked every year systematically, but under communism, this is most, like I said, the memory of the Polish helpers, the people who allegedly helped the ghetto fighters. At some point, the situation becomes so grotesque that one of the survivors of the ghetto fight, Marek Edelman, who still lives in Poland, is not allowed to participate in the commemorations in the 80s. In fact, systematically, the Jewish organizations that still exist in Poland throughout the communist period are being excluded from the commemorations. This is an event organized by ethnically Polish partisans and their organizations and by the Polish government to mark, to highlight, to spotlight the Polish help. And this is heavily politicized internationally as well. This is with the intention of saying, we the Poles helped, while those Germans over there were the killers. That is the kind of optics of the event. This obviously changes in the 90s. Suddenly Edelman, who throughout 80s organizes alternative commemorations, typically a day before or a day after, suddenly he's now allowed to participate. And now the event from the 90s onwards is about Jewish suffering. And the Jewish survivors or their children are invited, and they are speaking at the event quite often as well. So things change, very visible, very important things change. There is more impact on education as well. This is a photograph from the March of the Living, which technically starts in 1988, so already in the last year of the kind of socialist Poland. And this is an event predominantly aimed at Jewish youth from Israel and diaspora, but Polish youth participates in this as well. So throughout 90s and early 2000s, we actually see that more and more Polish teenagers are invited to participate in that event, to learn about what Auschwitz really was, to meet with teenagers from Israel, for example. Whether or not this even works and does its job, that's another matter. There is quite a lot of controversy about it, going multiple levels. As you can see, three smiling girls don't necessarily speak to us as someone who really learned the lessons from Auschwitz. Nevertheless, there is definitely more impact, more interest in educating young Poles about the Holocaust in ways that it didn't happen before. And so we can definitely see that quite a lot have changed. And I'm going to show you more museums, for example, in a second as well. But I want to stop here for a second and talk about a problem with some of those changes. A lot of the research that we do currently about how Holocaust is commemorated after '89 identifies a big problem with those commemorations. On the one hand, obviously, in my research, I question the fact that '89 is such a big threshold. I would suggest that it isn't. I showed you some of the ideas, some of the ways in which Holocaust was commemorated before the fall of communism. But if we only look at the commemorations such as this one, the new way of remembering the ghetto, the March of Living, the multiple other things that actually happen in the country quite systematically in quite large scale, the big problem with those commemorations is that they are quite superficial. One of the authors, Michael Meng, who writes about this topic, calls this redemptive cosmopolitanism. The idea here is that in Poland, also Meng writes about Poland and Germany, and the same concept is kind of attached to other places, to this country as well. It is quite easy to remember the Holocaust, or rather it is quite easy to remember the minorities that do not exist in the country anymore. Today, in the current political climate, well, maybe not necessarily current political climate, but 10 years ago, it was good to be seen as multicultural, as open-minded. Certainly, when Poland was working on its accession to the NATO and EU, there was quite a lot of political pressure at Poles to demonstrate that they adhere to the Western values of multiculturalism, of cosmopolitanism, of openness. And Holocaust commemorations fitted neatly in that attempt to demonstrate that Poland has done its lesson, that subscribe to Western values of openness. Because it is quite easy to remember people who are not there anymore. It is quite easy to invite Edelman once a year to commemorations. It is quite easy to send a couple of teenagers from a local high school to a March of the Living. this doesn't actually require thinking about the place of the refugees in our societies. This doesn't require people to challenge their actual perception of ethnic minorities in our communities. The work of remembering the Holocaust in 1980,000 is often criticized for being too easy and too superficial. Yes, we will include information about the Holocaust in education. Yes, we will organize all those nice campaigns, elect some more monuments, maybe open up a museum, but this doesn't often, it is often said, it doesn't actually challenge the prejudice. It doesn't actually address the anti-Semitism that is still quite present in Poland. It's only on the surface. Redemptive cosmopolitanism, something that serves to say that, yes, we have done our lesson, but without really addressing the current issues that currently are there with refugees, with minorities. And so that is the kind of problem that is very often identified here. Again, I am not entirely sure I fully subscribe to this. I definitely see that some of the work of remembrance these days goes that way. It is superficial, it is shallow, it doesn't address the core of the problem. Importantly, for me and for the way I kind of want to talk about the Holocaust memory today, very often Holocaust is not necessarily used to stretch the boundaries of Polishness, like I said at the very beginning. But sometimes, luckily, it is. Here, what you can see is the Schindler's Factory Museum in Krakow, opened in 2010. This is the museum opened in the factory, the original building of the factory used by Oskar Schindler, and it is the Museum of Krakowians. That is its premise, is the Krakowians at war. The idea for the museum from the get-go, from the moment that it was conceived to the execution, was that it is the museum showing the story of people from Krakow, whatever religion they are. So there is the big distinction in this museum between Christians and Jews. And at the very beginning in the story in the museum unfolds chronologically. The rooms start from mid-39, going chronologically room after room to the end of the war. And the idea is that at the beginning of the story, the Jewish Krakowians and Christian Krakowians, as the museum refers to them, are depicted together in the same streets, at the same university. And it's only slowly that the separation is introduced, and it's very obviously a separation introduced by the Nazis. So the idea for the museum is to show that both groups belong together and not are separate. This is the history of us Krakowians, and this history is partially the Holocaust history, partially history of Polish partisans, or whatever else. On this particular photograph, you can see the section showing the ghetto history, and this is the first section in which the museum, in space of the exhibition, isolates Jewish Krakowians from Christian Krakowians, because the isolation was imposed by the ghetto wall. And that is how the story is told. Only from this moment, when we start to see the ghetto in its existence, we see the isolation happening. And so only now, if you go to visit the museum, and I know some of you will go and visit the museum in a couple of months, you will now walk through it, seeing the Jewish story on one side and the Christian story on the other side. Nevertheless, this is done in such a way that I think actually brings together all the stories and is very much using the story of Jewish Krakowians to open up the borders of what it is to be Krakowian, to be Polish. Similarly, other things than just Holocaust memories serve similar purpose. The Festival of Jewish Culture in Krakow, a very big event. Currently, apparently, in Poland, there's around 20 annual festivals somehow commemorating the Holocaust, Jewish past of towns and cities. But the one in Krakow is by far the biggest and the oldest. It started in '88 and runs every year to Sfar. And the uniqueness and the importance of this festival lies in the fact that, unlike a lot of the smaller festivals, this one is not just a showcase of the past Jewish culture. It's not just a couple of Poles trying to pass for klezmers, playing some klezmer music they found in the archive. This also happens here. But rather, this festival is so big that it brings Jewish artists, Jewish intellectuals, Jewish speakers from Israel, from New York, from wherever else they live in diaspora. And so the people who come to the festival are not exposed to an image of a Jew, slightly fantastical, slightly romanticized, but rather they actually met real Jewish people who speak in Hebrew or in English, who perform in their language, who do modern art, not just klezmer music. And so obviously klezmer music is a very big part of it. Actually, what you can see here is a performance of klezmer music. This is the final night of the festival. It draws thousands to Kazimierz. But aside from that, there is plenty of contact between ethnic Poles and Jewish people from all over the world. And this is one of the very big moments when Poles actually see that it is not enough to just remember the past Jews, the figure of the Jew, the person who's left, who's gone. It is important to remember the people to encounter, to engage with people who live, who have their own problems, they need their own rights today in the present. So this is one of the spaces when this happens. Controversially, I'm also going to try to validate this. This is Szeroka Street. Festival takes place on Szeroka. This is also a place, this is also a photograph from Szeroka. But what I also want to bring to your attention is that actually Kazimierz today, Szeroka Street, and there are other places like that in Warsaw as well, were turned into what some of people call Jewish Disneyland. What you see on this photograph is a series of restaurants run by ethnic Poles pretending to be somehow Jewish themed, or being Jewish themed. The most infamous of those is the one over here in the corner of the picture. You can see on the electric menorah that lights up in the night with two plaster lions of Judah. Very, very tacky. No actual Jews involved in that place. At some point in the 90s, the waiters were wearing white and black garb, sort of pretending to be Jewish. Luckily, that is gone. And so this places like that, the whole Szeroka Street is criticized to be the kind of simulation of Jewishness without any Jewish people actually involved in it. And this is right. And I'm not going to try to excuse that. But what I want to say is that this is also a space which is becoming more robust in how the Jewishness is depicted there. Owners of some of those restaurants and coffee shops are genuinely learning, and they pride themselves for learning. One of the chains now of a couple of coffee shops and restaurants is run by people who also run a publishing company specializing in Jewish history, and they praise themselves of inviting Jewish grandmas and learning the recipes from Jewish grandmas and changing the recipes of things they serve in their coffee shops and restaurants accordingly. So that is happening. But what I also want to say is, importantly for Polish culture, this is a place of encountering positive image of Jewishness, not of the Holocaust suffering, and not of the negatively stereotypical Jew, the Jew with the coin who has uncanny ability with the money, the Jew blood-sucking figure from the legends about killing children for matzah. This is a positive space of positive encounter, and that is valuable in Poland, even today. Seeing Jews as someone who is not who is a little bit stereotypicized here, but in a positive way, that is a step forward that allows some Poles to maybe not include Jewishness in space of Polishness, but at least acknowledge that these are not antithetical things. We don't have to hate Jews. And so there is some positive work performed by spaces like Szeroka Street. And it is a stepping stone, in my opinion, towards further potential for further work to be done with including Jewishness instead of Polishness. And I want to finish off with this. This is a Polish Museum of History of Polish Jews, which was opened in 2013 in Warsaw. And I'm finishing with this not only because I have started with the same space. You can see in the corner the Ghetto Heroes Memorial. And so the space that was supposed to be a robust commemoration of Jewish suffering and Jewish life, which ultimately for most of the post-war period only had this one monument. Now it is that. Now it is a space where Jewish life can be commemorated in all of its extensive long history in Poland. But it is also a monument that is in the capital city, and that also matters. A lot of the things I showed you today, even the museum in Kraków, or especially the smaller Holocaust memorials spread across Poland, these are very important. They perform some kind of work in their communities. But it is also important that in a capital city, a big scale project was organized to mark the suffering. This museum has a Holocaust section, but mostly also the millennium of Jewish history, of Jewish life in Poland, because that again confirms that there should be space for Jewishness in Polishness. There is certainly symbolically space for Jewishness in the capital city of Poland. And so I think that while we are right to criticize a lot of the projects for being superficial, we should also remember that there are some projects which are quite positive, which really bring that Jewish history and that Holocaust history in space of Polish history. And so this is what I want to leave you with. Thank you very much.
The camera.
Right, well, thank you, Yannick, for a wonderfully wide-ranging, but at the same time, I think very textured account with lots of interesting sources. So the floor is open for questions, and if people on screen want to put questions into the chat, that's also fine.
Oh, no, sorry.
Gentlemen.
Wait, Mike.
Thanks, very interesting lecture. What I was curious about is at the end, you were talking about the Jewish memorial that's been built in Warsaw and so on. But are there any, what's the Jewish involvement? Are there many Jews in Poland left? Or what's the sort of situation you're saying about people not being part of the Polish sort of setup? Are there any Jews left? Are they involved in these projects? How does that work?
This is a very good question. I kind of hope that maybe someone will ask that. One of the reasons why I can genuinely be quite optimistic about the changes, even the tacky changes happening in Polish memorialscape, is because actually they do lead to re-emergence of Jewish in Poland. At the end of the communist period, and even at the beginning of the 21st century, the census of 2001 registered 1,133 people who claimed to be Jewish, who admitted to their Jewishness. So basically, there was no Jews left in Poland at the beginning of the 21st century. The Holocaust, the forced migrations attest to that. But also the spirit of anti-Semitism, so visible, so present. Now, the latest census registered number of Jewish people at 15,000. Probably part of that number are the migrants who are moving to Poland and think quite comfortably about exhibiting their Jewishness. But largely, the people who are now recovering their Jewishness are the people whose parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents decided after the war to hid their Jewishness. And those people are now coming back. This is possible partially because of the spaces like those in Kazimierz, where Jewishness can be visible, celebrated in a safe way, safe for people doing the celebrating. In Kazimierz, there are 7 remaining synagogues which were renovated, which actually ethnic Poles renovated, and now those synagogues serve the community. People can go and meet and pray in them. So that is possible. And because of those very positive developments, because of this kind of stretching the borders of Polishness, at least some people deciding to acknowledge that, yes, you can be Jewish and Polish at the same time, a lot more people feel comfortable in recovering their Jewishness and basically admitting, coming out into their Jewishness. And so, yes, we see that. A lot of the projects that I talked about were actually organized by ethnic Poles. So even the Krakow museums, the synagogues, renovations of them, a lot of that is the ethnic Poles doing that job, because this was happening at the stage where there were so few people comfortably accepting their Jewishness, acknowledging their Jewishness. Poland is slightly different. Poland has quite a lot of curators who are Jewish, and now obviously people working there, volunteering there in variety of projects are obviously also Jewish as well. So there is a big change there.
Mm-hmm. There's a couple of questions on screen. I couldn't see who put their hand up first, so forgive me. But so Katarzyna Rajczak, do you want to unmute yourself? And
do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Well, I joined this talk because I'm sorry for my English, first of all, because I'm talking from Poland. So I guess I'm the only Polish person in the audience. Well, I joined the talk because of the controversial title, first of all. And I really wanted to hear what will be said. What I missed in the talk, it was a good presentation, but what I missed here was a broader perspective and background for what was discussed. I mean, for example, for decades after the war, Poles did not hear, read, or learn about many things, not only about the Holocaust. We didn't learn about the Karten massacre. We didn't learn about the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, for example, about the concentration camp for Polish children in my city, Lodz. So this was only a few years ago that people in Poland started learning about this concentration camp for Polish children. We didn't hear, we didn't read about the so-called cursed soldiers who were fighting against the Soviet occupation of Poland. So again, this is like 10 years that we discuss these things. So if you, I mean, non-Polish people get this background, they will understand why why people didn't hear so much about the Holocaust. It's easier to understand that. And note that after 1989, the post-communist governments, which actually consisted of ex-communists, didn't really bother to commemorate these aspects of Polish history that I mentioned. For example, the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 only opened in 2020, so a few years ago. So there was not much talk about that for decades. And while communist authorities forgot Jews after the war, they didn't forget Polish enemies of communism, or alleged enemies, because lots of Poles fighting in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 were actually arrested, imprisoned, persecuted for decades after the war. And
So can I sort of maybe interrupt and ask you to sort of bring that into a question that you'd like Yannick to
well, why was this background missing? Because it's important for non-Poles to realize that Poles didn't learn a lot of things. Why it was missing?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. There are, I guess, two reasons. One is very practical, because every lecturer has to make some selections and there's only so much time in the lecture. But more importantly, I don't want to excuse myself just because of time. More importantly, the reason why I've made this selection the way I've made it is because I agree, a lot of other topics were forgotten or obscured in various ways. But there is a different reason for forgetting different things. And so while communist authorities at different stages of their history made different efforts to forget or transform memory of Armia Krajowa or whatever else, and certainly never commemorated the partisans trying to fight with communists in the late 40s, early 50s. This was done for different reasons than forgetting or obscuring, some would note, of the Holocaust. And so the reason why I'm selecting this is because I'm not necessarily interested in the sins of the communist government as such. Rather, I'm interested in how we in Poland, I'm Polish as well, how Poles define the nation. And so from that perspective, that question about whether or not Jewishness belongs in Polishness, Jewish history belongs in Polish history, how this was depicted, this is what interests me, and this is why I made this selection. In the ideal world, I would probably love to, offer multiple lectures like this one on Polish history. I can imagine that my audience wouldn't be as big as it is today. So there is practicality of it as well. But for the most important reason for me wasn't even the practicality. It is because the communist government forgot or remade the memory of AK or whatever else for different reasons that it Polonized the Holocaust. And that is what I was trying to do. Why, how Poles grapple with ethnic minorities and that memory.
Okay, I'll stay on the screen and then come back into the room. Anthony Davis.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep, thank you.
I'm the chairman of the Karten trustees, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for a very moving talk, which I think gave us a very good insight into some of the more unpleasant aspects of recent Polish history. I realize, in the light of what the last speaker said, not comprehensive, but certainly those which mean a lot to Jews. And particularly, I wanted to thank Southampton University for holding this lecture in Ian Karten's memory. But more than that, just to remind you that he was actually Polish. This is a talk which would have been very, very interesting to him, and which I think perhaps he would have found quite disturbing in many ways. It was only by virtue of the fact that he was Polish that he avoided being interned during the war, and in fact served in the Polish Air Force immediately after the war, right at the end of the war and immediately afterwards. So there's a particular poignancy to this talk. And I therefore, on behalf of the trustees, really do appreciate very much that you've given it and you've taken the time to prepare it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anthony. Those comments mean a great deal to us, actually. Thank you. There's some questions in the room, Mark.
Yes, thank you. Janet just mentioned the character of the Polish nation, and I wanted to focus on that interesting source you had from 1987 in the Catholic Weekly or whatever it was, which made me think about the attitude of the Catholic Church to the Holocaust or the Jewish question in Poland, because I was a bit surprised that that appeared in a Catholic Weekly. So what was the attitude of the Catholic Church to the Jewish question under the communist period, and has it actually changed, shifted in the last 30 years? I know it's rather a vast question, but anyway.
It is vast, but also it not necessarily is very vast. In principle, Polish Catholic Church was never very necessarily interested in commemorating the Holocaust as such. And certainly today, a lot of the bishops in Polish Catholic Church are very conservative and are not interested at all in topics like this one. But there was this moment in 70s and 80s where a number of quite liberal intellectuals associated themselves with the church, and church was open for them. And there were a number of liberal intellectuals in church, bishops, high-ranking priests, who have done quite a lot of work on the recovery of those stories. Most of the things that currently come to my mind are probably the intellectuals who are not necessarily priests or bishops themselves, but rather are Catholic and are kind of Catholic in the liberal way. The sins of omissions or the sins towards our Jewish brothers is what matters to them, what drives them to recover those Jewish stories. So this kind of period of 70s and 80s is where we see that maybe not necessarily in the institutional church as such, but around it in various clubs, the Catholic intelligentsia clubs, intellectuals associated with it, the Catholic Weekly, the Tygodnik Powszechny, which is quite notorious for its liberalism these days. These are the kind of spaces where we see that recovery. At the same time, obviously, the Polish Catholic Church, following the kind of general development, at some point on recognized that Jews are not guilty of Christ's death, and all that kind of stuff started to happen as well. And it challenged a lot of the anti-Semitic teaching that was quite visible. A lot of the 1930s priests were unfortunately quite anti-Semitic, and this probably accounts for some of the political participation as well. So that was challenged inside of the church structures as well.
Peter?
Thank you for a fascinating talk, and I enjoyed the positive impression you left us with at the end. Forgive this rather provocative question, but is past Polish nationalist silence or superficiality about Jewish suffering, and is it related to sensitivity about the role of some Poles in the Holocaust? And is the portrayal of Poles as all victims and opponents of Nazism partly a way of avoiding that sensitive issue?
Do I have another 45 minutes? Because it just so happens I have a perfect presentation to answer the question. I've given a lecture on that to my second year students actually on Monday. In Poland, we often think of ourselves as bystanders to the Holocaust. Bystanders denominating here people who are outside and who are passive. A lot of the research today obviously challenges the concept of bystanders in general in terms of the Holocaust, especially in terms of Holocaust in Poland, because there were some Poles who participated in killings. There were some Poles who were indifferent. There were some Poles who were helpers as well. So the spectrum is much bigger, and the term bystander doesn't actually fit in it. The lecture I gave to students on Monday, and this is derived from my research on these Couch reports I shared with you as well. My contention is that the idea of a bystander is very much the answer to those questions that you've asked. There is some memory and some recognition of the fact that the Polish record vis-a-vis the Holocaust isn't just that of help, and that memory was there. And so the way of coping with that memory is this development in culture of the figure of the bystander, which is supposed to be the figure of someone who could not do more, who stands outside, who does not have any moral obligation towards the Jews. And one of the aspects of this creation of the figure of the bystander is this maintaining of a distinction between us and them, between Poles and Jews. So actually the bystander, the idea of the bystander is supposed to shrink the boundaries of Polishness and say the Jews are not Polish, therefore there is no moral obligation to support. There was never any moral obligation to support them. So, when Błoński says we sinned against our brothers, the Polish nationalists who subscribe to the idea of the bystander say, no, we didn't, because we don't owe them anything. They are not us. And so this figure of the bystander emerges in the post-war period precisely, in my opinion, to address some of those issues. Obviously there is this moral stake there, but some of that definitely happens there. And so, that's my answer. As a kind of curious example of how this is done in practice, in the reports I'm reading from the Scouts, very often we see that a lot of the Jewish suffering is attached to, there are authors of the suffering visible. The Nazis, the SS man, the Gestapo came and killed, done something. And then suddenly there is a lot of passive voice in places. Some Jews escaped the killing action. They hid in the forest. They were found and done away with. Who's doing the finding and doing away with? I cannot say for sure, but in some cases we actually know from all the research done by my colleagues that actually those were ethnic Poles. And so even in the space of those testimonies I look at from 65, this idea of somehow that uncomfortable knowledge seeping through, but in a way that is safe, that is very visible. So that knowledge is there, that knowledge being dealt with, and the idea of bystander, passive, detached is there to address that.
Okay, I'll come back to the online for a moment. There's a question in the chat from Mike and Barbara Cooper. To what extent is the national memory of the Holocaust in Poland centered on named individuals, whether they were victims, resistance fighters, collaborators, or tacit collaborators? If there is any substantial sense of individuals, then who do you think are the most remembered and why?
I don't think we focus on the individuals very much. Marek Edelman, who I've mentioned a couple of times in my talk, is probably one of the only recognizable names, largely because he was quite a big figure in kind of oppositional movement in the 80s in Poland, and he's done quite a lot to try to commemorate the uprising. So he's the only person who's really kind of remembered for his role both during the uprising and afterwards as well. But mostly this is a memorial which is quite anonymous. Actually, in some of my research, when I look at the memorials, there are no names on them. There's the Jews, the Żydzi, that category is employed, but very often it's quite anonymous. Partially, this is because of the scale. The number of people who died is impossible to commemorate outside of projects like Yad Vashem, who was trying to catalog all the names. But in kind of public commemorations, in monuments, in schools, that is quite hard to do. And so there are very, very few efforts. Curiously, and this is kind of a little bit of an asset, but you did ask about collaborators as well. Actually, one of the only occasions when we see names mentioned in context of Holocaust memory is sometimes Polish helpers are remembered by name, and sometimes some of the collaborators. And the reason why collaborators are actually remembered by name while their victims are not, I think, is from the fact that it is possible in Polish culture to talk about, we actually have the word szwancownicy, the people from the margins who were always career criminals before the war, career criminals during the war. And we name them in a kind of idea of naming and shaming. So in some of the testimonies I look at, we will not learn the names of the Jewish victims, even if those victims sometimes are allowed to speak in testimonies, but rather we will only learn that such and such was a traitor to the Polish cause, he collaborated with the Nazis, and his name is retained. But we very rarely see the names of the victims.
Okay, and Danny Harble, do you want to unmute and...
Yes, you showed us some in Krakow in tourist centres where there was a sort of, if you like, a sort of commemoration of a Jewish existence. But all over Poland, there are quite a few Jewish spaces that have been created with no Jewish input. How well are they received generally amongst local people in the provinces across the country? And also, nearly every Jewish cemetery in Poland has been devastated. And I know there are some places where they've still started to raise funds to try and restore them. What sort of response do they have? I mean, are people interested or not interested, or do they think, forget it, we don't want to know that, that's the past? What's the response for both of those?
Thank you very much. It's a very mixed bag. Apparently, it always has been. Actually, very recently, a book came out which documents what's happening in the cemeteries and synagogues in the post-war period in provinces. So it looks at smaller towns and villages, not at Warsaw and Kraków only. And I think the findings from the book are actually quite applicable to what we see happening today as well. There are some people, some local activists, maybe school teachers, maybe history teachers, who are very interested in covering the past. And they organize projects and they bring their school children to those spaces to try to renovate or at least weed the cemeteries. So there is a little bit of that. And then obviously there are people who are not interested at all. These days, in modern day Poland, I think there are relatively few, I guess anti-Semitic, I should call them, projects. So in communist Poland, we actually seen quite a lot of those formerly Jewish spaces, those old synagogues without any Jews praying in them, those old cemeteries without any people who use them, they were being leveled. So for example, in my hometown, the Jewish cemetery is now limited to, 25 square meters maybe, whereas we know it's stretched quite wide and most of it is now allotments, unfortunately. So those kind of stories, those were things happening quite often in 50s, 60s, even 70s. These days, that rather doesn't happen. There is no attempt to destroy. Obviously, there is some anti-Semitism, and there will be maybe occasional anti-Semites scribbling something in spray paint, but that also happens relatively rarely, I think. I'm quite upbeat. There is more projects, there is some interest, but there is also quite a lot indifference still.
Okay, we'll come back into the room. You had a question, I think? Yeah.
Thank you. That was incredibly informative. My question is perhaps very speculative in nature, but I wonder if the conflict in Israel-Gaza is likely to have an influence on the attitudes of Poles. If it doesn't at the moment, is it likely to, and therefore will it have an impact on how the Holocaust is commemorated in the future?
it certainly will. We will see how. It definitely will. I guess to some extent we see this in this country, and there is this kind of generational divide as well. I imagine that's my feeling as well. There is quite a lot of people from maybe younger generations who are quite pro-Gaza, sometimes in very uncritical way, sometimes in very critical way. Whereas there is also quite a lot of people in younger generations who are quite uncritically pro-Israeli, and that kind of pattern probably is going to be replicated in Poland. I don't live in Poland anymore, so I don't actually feel the pulse of those changes, but I bet there will be massive change. And I'm quite sure there will be, because one of the big kind of pivotal moments in how Poles perceive the Jews is actually the 67 war, which gave the start to a lot of the anti-Semitic campaign in 67, and then obviously to the recovery of the Jewish films. So I bet this war, being so controversial and so well publicized, is going to somehow affect things. How? No idea.
Thank you. Tony.
Sorry, a long way. But I think.
Thank you very much, Yannick, for a great lecture. Could I ask you a little bit more about the Scouts project and how much, from what you've gathered from the particular responses, how much local autonomy people had, Scout leaders, in sort of scoping what they should cover, what they shouldn't cover, or is it more neutral than that?
This is something that is actually of great interest to me, because like one of the speakers said, one of the questions said earlier, communist government was infamous for its manipulation of memory. So in a way, I was actually quite expecting quite a lot of that. When I first encountered those reports last summer, I assumed this is going to be heavily censored stuff, and that I will have to really try to weed some information really between the lines. It seems to me that this is not necessarily the case. From what I'm seeing, from what I managed to piece together about how that whole initiative was organized, is that there was quite a lot of interest centrally to set it up. You know, the reports that you've seen, somebody designed that, printed that, put some thought into what questions Scouts should be asking, and then just released it into the wild, so to speak. The instructions that arrive with the Scouts in the localities are quite simple. This is basically like a one-page order to organize this reconnaissance, as it's referred to. Suggestion is to contact, obviously, elderly people who do remember. That's the kind of precondition for it. Ideally, people who are part of the official combatant organization. There is one at this stage that exists. And ideally, maybe also army members, if there is a local army unit, for example. But that's not necessary. And actually, very often we see that a lot of the Scouts are in no position to talk to the members of the official combatant organization, simply because those people are few and far between, and they live mostly in bigger cities. So especially in towns and villages, the Scouts just locate people who remember. There doesn't seem to be much pre-selection happening. I was expecting some firmer guidelines. I was actually expecting that the guidelines will be predominantly about the treatment of the Armia Krajowa, so the clandestine Polish force that existed during the war and was anti-communist. There isn't anything about that. There is no guidelines about how to treat the Holocaust past. And from the way it was set up, it seems that the stories are told the way the witnesses want to tell them and the Scouts want to record them. So yes, there is some sort of kind of auto-censorship. People exist in this culture, which is heavily censored, and they appropriate templates of talking about the past and that culture, but there does not seem more than that. In fact, there is a publication created in just a year after the report, kind of highlighting the success of this reconnaissance. And that is heavily censored, and that is genuinely just depicting what the communist government prioritizes in memory. But I also know that it's heavily selected. There's just a couple of reports that were publicized, and the rest was left in the archive. And it seems that at the level of the meeting between the Scouts and the witnesses, it is genuinely those people speaking and Scouts recording those voices, how they understood it, the language they had at their disposal. And if there is any censorship, it's only at the level of central reporting. but the reports themselves seems to be genuinely depicting what happened on the ground in 65.
Okay, so there's a question in the chat by someone whose initials are MA, so I don't know what that stands for. Given all that you've described today, and also
You can ask him to ask it.
well, it's not the same person.
Hands up.
Oh, is it? Oh, sorry. Is it Mike? Is it Mike Cooper? Is that your question? Yeah. Do you want
It
to
is
just
indeed,
unmute?
yes.
Sorry, Mike. Do
Second
you want to
one.
just unmute and ask yourself rather than me?
Yes, by all means. Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk, and sorry to be greedy with two questions. Given all that you've described today, and also given the recent political changes in Poland, how optimistic are you for the future of this business of remembrance amongst Poles?
The most recent political changes are actually probably giving me a bit more optimism, because the current government is maybe only for political reasons, maybe for because of genuine interest, probably more interested in those kind of stories. It's more liberal than the previous government. So that is definitely something that should probably help rather than hinder. The previous government prioritized very kind of nationalistic remembrance, and Holocaust was never quite a priority, but it was also never suppressed in the way that it was officially suppressed under communism. So I think these days those processes will kind of have their own dynamic, and because there's so much more people coming back to the Jewishness one way or another, and therefore so much more people with a bigger stake in remembering the Holocaust, I think those projects are going to continue as well. It will probably partially depend on the funding as well, and I guess with the current new government that we have coming in Poland, there might be more chances on, for example, funding for local projects to renovate a local cemetery or a local synagogue. We'll see.
Thank you.
Am I allowed to ask a question? I wondered if the Russian invasion of Ukraine has shaped or informed any recent developments in that Polish memory, especially considering how Russia, the contemporary Russian government, manipulates Holocaust memory in service of their own political gains.
We're getting into the direction of questions that I'm not very comfortable answering. Some of my recent answers were quite speculative. I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian working at 1960s. So it will be a speculation. It's an interesting problem, especially because I think the thrust of the changes goes somewhere else. Polish-Ukrainian history in itself is very contested. Parts of what is today Ukraine were, well, essentially colonized by Poland, and are often today seen as Polish lands. Obviously, there's ethnically almost no Poles living there, but there are those vivid images we have of the Kresy, of basically Lviv as being Polish. It used to be ethnically Polish before the war. And I even remember from my time at university in the early 2000s, those posters of fringe right-wing groups saying, oh, when will we recover Lviv? And so the first invasion of Russia, I think, actually forced us to look at that kind of narrative. There is the big issue of the Ukrainian insurgent army, which at the end of the Second World War, obviously massacred plenty of Poles for reasons which historically are understandable, but also massacres happened. And so there's obviously plenty of animosity because of that. And so there's plenty of challenges to be worked out in this kind of area of Polish-Ukrainian remembrance. And I think we will have to really think about that. And that is where the changes are going to be. I'm not entirely sure if the bizarre comments of Putin about Ukrainian fascists and Hitlerites are going to somehow impact memory of the Holocaust in Poland. There is other problems we exist in that area and will need to be really worked through.
Okay, so there's one last one in the chat for you, Yannick. Rather you than me. How has the Holocaust memory altered through the years in the Polish film industry?
I think Emily is somewhere there.
Yeah, she is.
Emily, do you want to jump in? I'm joking ever so slightly. This is actually an interesting question. I think the Polish filmography. I'm not a film scholar, so Emily is here. She's an expert. Please get in touch. Whoever asked a question with Emily, she might be able to give you more answers. But from what I understand about Polish cinema, is that actually the changes that we see from the end of the war to today probably in some ways follow the kind of global changes as well. Early on, there's a couple of films talking about the Holocaust experience in 40s. Then later on, that obviously kind of is submerged. There is no official interest in commemorating the Holocaust, like I said, but there are films made that can be read as Holocaust films. The same happens in France and in the West as well. Films that are maybe about camps, or films that are maybe about the kind of misery of warriors, which we could see as Holocaust films. More recently, obviously, there were a couple of films in 2000s which were trying to grapple with the very challenging aspects of the kind of Polish Jewish history. In a couple of weeks, we're going to have a screening here at the University of Ida, which is a Polish film about a nun who discovers that she was actually Jewish. And during the war, as a child, she was given to a nunnery for safekeeping, and the nuns brought her up as Polish. This is a very common occurrence. A lot of the Jewish children were Christianized, and on the one hand, they survived the war. On the other hand, they later grappled with this kind of dual identity, the fact that they were forced maybe even to drop part of their identity. And there were equally also films about the Poles in Jedwabne, so the Polish killers, so that kind of made its way to the cinema. So some of those kind of films address those issues. There's, I think, more and more of films that are addressing Jewish culture more broadly, so are moving away only from remembering the death and destruction towards looking at the importance for Jewish culture for Polish culture more broadly. One of the things we consider for the screening is called Demon, which is actually about the kind of figure of a Dybbuk, so the kind of Jewish myth which kind of made its way to Polish culture. So there is some space for Jewish topics in Polish cinema and it's growing. But do ask Emily.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Yannick, for again for your lecture and for your sort of lucid and engaging answers to what were some incredibly wide-ranging and also very, very broad questions. It's just great, really, to have the opportunity to acknowledge what a sort of a wonderful addition to the Parks Institute that we have in you being here, and to say we look forward to many more lectures on equally fascinating topics in years to come. So thank you all as well for being here. Thank you everybody on the screen for joining us, and for your questions online as well. And I'd like also just once again to take the opportunity to thank the Karten Charitable Trust for the wonderful support that they've given us over the years. It's appreciated enormously by all of us. And again, we look forward to many more such lectures in the future. So thank you very much. And thank you, Yannick.